Welcome to the Bicurian podcast, where we explore and embrace the seeming contradictions of life. What actually is Bicurian, you ask?
Well, you may not necessarily have a mental concept of Bicurian, partially maybe because it's a made-up word. You embody it. What's happening right now in terms of the divisions between us is a focus on that which is different.
And lack of understanding and empathy for people's beliefs is no longer an excuse.
And it is in the differences we carry in ourselves that we find the Bicurian moment.
When you really dig into something, you're going to see some depth to it. It's not just a race thing. It's not just a conservation thing.
It's letting go of the or to make room for the and. We embrace all of you. Welcome to the Bicurian.
Welcome to the Bicurian. I'm Eric.
And I'm Aisla.
And what are we doing this week?
We are talking to two very interesting people about, well, a topic.
All right. This will be fun.
How about we start with asking our wonderful guests to introduce themselves?
So, Robin, you can go first. I picked that arbitrarily because your name was first on the screen.
Definitely not first alphabetically. So, hi, my name is Robin Oakes, and I live in Boston. I have identified as bisexual for 42 years and 10 months. And I love telling people that because there's that silly, silly myth that bisexuality is just a phase. And for me, it's been my experience since my first month of college. I am an editor and a writer, and most importantly, I'm a speaker. I travel around the United States. I've spoken in 48 states so far, with 2 left to go. And I have also spoken in 15 other countries. I like to talk.
So, yay, I'm so glad you're on the cast.
Because of that, I will pass it on to the next speaker.
But I want to know which 2 states you're missing.
It's actually pretty easy to guess.
Alaska and Hawaii?
Yes. No, Alaska is one, though.
What's the other one?
Texas?
Mississippi. But it's interesting because when I ask people to guess, they usually guess Alaska and Hawaii. And then once one of those is excluded, then they, like Mississippi is usually the 4th or 5th within the first 5 guesses.
Nice.
Because of its wonderful progressive politics. And
They don't have those down there.
Poor Mississippi.
Maybe the sarcasm better. Yeah, poor Mississippi. But there are people in Mississippi doing good work, so I know that, and I have hope that Mississippi will come into my life soon.
So shall I introduce myself then?
Round 2.
My name is Gail Carragher, and I am a writer, mostly. I write, I guess, speculative fiction. I like to say commercial genre fiction with a lot of queer characters, and happy endings and found family is kind of my bailiwick. I am bi. I have always identified as bi because I'm not going to admit how long ago that was, but that was the identity that I got to have back then. And now I suppose I would qualify as pan, but it doesn't feel like a word I fought for in the same way that bisexuality does. And so I have just resigned myself to sticking with bi, although more recently I've really embraced queer as well as a moniker. I just like the word. I like getting to have a Q word that I associate with as a writer. It's very satisfying to me. So, yeah, I guess that's where I stand.
Q is the 10-point letter.
It's a great way. Exactly.
I just want to jump in and say that I also identify as pan and queer as well as bisexual. But I guess when I think about it, bi is my primary identity, and then queer and pansexual also work just fine.
Yeah, I wouldn't be offended or insulted if somebody used any of those words to describe me, I suppose is a way to put it.
So it sounds like we have very similar perspectives.
So in case our listeners haven't actually figured out here, just based on those introductions, this whole topic idea came up in a couple of quick conversations that Aisla had around the fact that the 3 of you, and this is my understanding, so correct me if I'm wrong, identify as being rather femme and bi, pan, queer but the interesting interactions you have around that obviously, looking butchy or something like that wouldn't be as much of a concern in your normal interactions. So,
and in queer spaces, we don't get clocked very often. So,
right.
It can feel a little bit upon first entering a queer space that it's a little nerve-wracking, and that's like, it's weird because most of the time, at least, I haven't experienced the aggression that most people who are, for lack of a better term, visually queer off the get-go get, because I look very femmy and very much like a girl next door kind of Midwestern type chick. So it's kind of an interesting scenario to be in, I guess, being sort of a femmy queer girl, is to know right off the bat that you get mundane acceptance, but that in queer space I've learned only recently, and I'm not a young person, that is a space I need to self-identify with, and I've only recently sort of professionally, as part of my identity, started to be like, oh right, I'm not going out into the world with my friends anymore as a professional, and so I need to just say I'm queer all the time, or people assume that I'm not. Because I just don't look it.
Yeah. And I thought it was a fascinating subject because I feel like just in general being bi even right now is it seems like the black sheep of LGBTQ, add other letters as necessary, right? Because we were actually talking, Aisla and I, before we did the show, and I made a joke that I saw on a TV show once about a kid said, I've got a black daddy and a white mommy, so I'm going to be accepted by both. And so in general, I feel like bi is kind of in that realm. So,
That's sarcasm, right?
Yeah. Completely sarcasm.
Just in case, because some people
No.
Yeah. I also want to say I don't identify as high femme. I identify sort of as semi-femme. And the interesting thing for me is that when I'm in the mainstream world, I don't feel very femme at all. I feel kind of in the middle. But when I'm in the LGBTQ plus community, that's where I feel very femme, because it's all depends. I think feminist sometimes partially depends on who you're standing next to, who you're being contrasted and compared with. And so so semi-femme in the mainstream world, and I guess femme in the LGBTQ world.
Mm-hmm. And so for me, I actually came out as a lesbian when I was 24. And Robin, you actually really made a difference in my life in that, and this is something I've never told you, and that when my wife and I were together for 9 years, and when we broke up, I started dating a male-bodied human. He's actually bisexual and genderqueer. So, but we look kind of hetero when we're together, and my lesbian community lost it, and it was really painful for me, and I felt so bad. And I was at that time working as the executive director of the LGBT center in my town. So I'm like organizing these huge rallies for equal rights, and my friends won't talk to me. And it was just like so painful. And I went to Creating Change, and there was this bisexual track that you had, I know, put in to really make happen. And I can't remember if you were presenting or if it was another section that I went to, but they were talking about biphobia. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, it wasn't personal. And I don't know why that made such a difference, but it really helped me to overcome some of the pain of that experience, to realize like this wasn't my friends suddenly deciding to hate me. This was this aspect of phobia that they had internalized, and that doesn't necessarily make it great that it happened, but it really helped me to cope and to say, oh, okay, I'm going to step into a new understanding of what this is. And so I just want you to know your work absolutely, it touches people. It definitely made a difference for me in terms of being able to like let go of something that was incredibly painful. And I embraced the word queer as well. However, there was a way in which I, as you said, Gail, like fought for the word bisexual and really paid the price of it. So I will use it at different times to kind of reclaim that experience, I guess.
It's also more recognized, for lack of a better term, in a wider casual interaction in Middle America, overseas, that kind of thing. If you say bi, people like have shorthand for that, whereas other words like pan just isn't as well known, or pansexual just isn't as well known, especially outside of the United States. And like queer is a loaded term, and there's a whole lot of baggage to unpack with that word. And so sometimes if you spout queer in kind of an unknown space, people will kind of jar and jump a little bit. Whereas bisexual, I guess, is like vocabulary-wise a little bit more accepted, even if it does often, the moment I say bisexual, I'm like, this is a loaded term. Like, how are we going to, what like arm of defense am I going to be trotting forward next? You know, like it's sort of, you prepare yourself for all the possible reactions to that. Yeah.
One of the challenges is that when you use the word bisexual, people have an idea of what it means that usually isn't the same as what it means to me. And I think there's a problem in that the dictionaries haven't caught up with us, with the community yet. And, you know, my definition of bisexuality is very different from what you would find in Merriam-Webster. And it's very frustrating because oftentimes people will trot that out as proof that bisexual is a binary term, or that bisexual equals just being attracted to, you know, men and women. And, you know, that's not the definition that most of the bisexual activists that I know are using. And can I say what my definition is?
I was just going to ask that. I would actually love to hear the definition that you have, because it's probably more in line with my personal one as well. So please.
I thought you'd never ask. So the definition of bisexuality that I use is one that actually you can, if you Google definition of bisexuality, it usually comes up on page 1. So that's progress. My definition is that I call myself bisexual because I acknowledge in myself the potential to be attracted romantically and or sexually to people of more than one gender, not necessarily at the same time, not necessarily in the same way, and not necessarily to the same degree. And for me, like, every word of that is really important, because I identified as bisexual for 5 years before I ever, quote unquote, acted on it. And I was bisexual then. And I was celibate for 6 years in my 30s, and I was bisexual then. And I have been with my wife now. We're right now in season 23 of our romantic comedy. And
that's so cute.
You know, we're in a relationship, but I'm bisexual because for me, my bisexuality is not about what I'm doing. I don't have to prove anything through action. My bisexuality is about how I understand myself. And though I may be married, I am not dead. And I still, you know, occasionally find random people attractive. Not too many of them, but occasionally. And, you know, so for me, bisexuality is identity of that holds my whole self, past, present, and future, interior and historic exterior, I guess. So for me, it's a very big word that holds a lot of potential.
So you kind of touched on something in one of the questions that I had that I'd love to hear the 3 different responses to. Because I completely agree. I love that definition because it's not so much the way in which it's acted upon, in my opinion. It's about just the identity and being able to acknowledge that, you know what, if you were unpartnered for some reason, or the right person came along or whatever, it might not matter what their, you know, sex was. So completely love that definition. But we do live in a couple-centric society. And you kind of touched on that. So how do you think it applies? Like, aside from, like you said, you're not dead, so you might be attracted. But I'd love to hear everyone's answer on that.
It's really hard because I think about this. I'm a person who really enjoys being single. And I have a partner, but I could see myself as happily single as well. But the always interesting thing with me when you start dating someone, start appearing publicly with someone, is that loss of identity in terms of you become an I and you turn into an us, and you're invited to social events as a couple, and that sort of same thing happens when you're a bisexual, when you start appearing in public with another person who may or may not be visually identified with one gender or another. And suddenly you, because of the inherent nature of coupledom within, our society, you get this associated usdom identity that also impacts your queer identity in one direction or another. And it does worry me and concern me, and it has sort of, for me personally, has had some strange sort of psychological effects, like because of where I live, which is the Bay Area, I am like really comfortable with PDA when my partner is a woman or visually female, or visually queer, because that seems to me a public display of both affection but also advocacy. I'm way less comfortable with PDA when my partner is a man or male identified or very visually masculine, because that feels like a sort of enforcing of heteronormativity. And it's just a weird, like, sort of psychological grapple for my brain to undertake. And I don't know if I have like a pat conclusion for this, but it is definitely something that I think about a lot in coupledom, because my own identity as a bisexual and my eagerness to make sure that space is defined publicly for me affects my behavior for my partner, and my comfort level with like how I visually appear with that partner in public. And it's just something that I've grappled with now, for a couple of decades. And I don't know where I'm going with it, but it's definitely something I think about a lot.
Yeah, I relate in that. So I'm in an open relationship, and I have actually at this point 2 male-bodied, somewhat genderqueer partners. I was like, I didn't know I had a type, but I guess I do. And and I went at one point to a queer event with one of my partners, and there was this 3-foot space between us and everybody. It was just and it was so different than when I would go to events with women and just realize like, oh, like we look straight, and we're probably 2 of the not straightest people in this room. Like when it comes right down to it, I guess you can't really say that, but neither of us is even close to straight. And similarly, when I was running the LGBT center here, I've run 2, and the second one that I ran, the number of times that people would ask me why a straight woman cares about queer issues, I'd be like, well, 1, we should all care about all the issues, let's be honest, and 2, why do you assume that? Like, what in anything that I'm doing makes that seem like what's happening? And the other thing about it actually was really great was being the leader of the community center, the number of people that came up to me and said, I actually feel welcome in a way that I never have before because you're here. Like there's a huge amount of genderqueer and bisexual people that really appreciated having someone at the helm who represented those identities. Either I'm not genderqueer, my partner is, and was very out, right? And so I would say that so that part of the coupleness was kind of helpful, but in general, for a lot of people, it does lead to this assumption of my identity. Like if I'm with a man, I must be straight. If I'm with a woman, then now I'm gay. Instead of, as you said, Robin, like it's just I am me all the way through. And I think I get more offended when the queer community does it, honestly, because I expect them to be more respectful of my strong female nature and not assume that who I'm with defines who I am. So I'm like, when is that okay? The straight community does that, but I don't think the queer community should ever do that. So
the reality is that we people in the Western world are very binary thinkers, and we tend to oversimplify all kinds of complex things into pretend this or that. The racial binary in the United States remains black and white, despite all evidence to the contrary. It's a ridiculous binary, but it persists. The political binaries, the gender binary, and I think that people are it seems that our minds are lazy, and we just keep putting things into, is it this slot or that slot? Is it this slot or that slot? And so we meet people, we read them, and we draw simple conclusions. And sometimes, at least for those of us who are attracted to people of more than one gender, or have the potential to be attracted to people of more than one gender, sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes we're read incorrectly. And I think that's a big challenge for bi people, because in order to be read correctly, we either have to walk down the street with two partners at all times. You could keep two partners of different genders in your pocket and embrace them in public. But, short of that, I think we will constantly be misread, and we have to constantly correct and speak up and say what our identity is. The only alternative to that, of course, is to wear a T-shirt.
Yes.
Yeah, I've been told by people that basically, unless you're amorous or in some way in an open relationship, you can't be bi, right? Because you're either one or the other at any given time. So, and that is something I've definitely heard more than once.
And that's the misunderstanding of what bisexual means in the first place. The idea that bisexual means current behavior or current activity, which it doesn't necessarily.
Yeah. One of the things that I do, and I'm afraid I will be the facetious one in this conversation, being a comedy author, but one of the things that I took to doing, and I still just do, is I assume everyone I meet is bi, and then I'm horribly disappointed when they turn out to be straight. But most of the time I'm just going to assume everyone I meet is open to every gender, and there we go. That way I'm giving, as far as I'm concerned, everyone the benefit of the doubt. But that's just my tiny little willful, fight the system. But yeah, it just means I go through life horribly disappointed all the time.
I did that a little bit to my kids. I wanted them to grow up obviously they grew up in a queer household, but I wanted them to grow up kind of thinking about it. And my daughter was like, "No, I'm straight." And I'm like, "Are you sure?" And finally, when
don't pigeonhole yourself too young.
And when she went to college, she had to do something to describe herself, and she said, "I'm proof that you can't make someone gay." I was like, "Well, there you go." At least I know they thought about it. That was all I cared about.
I've had a lot of my friends come up to me over the years and apologize for their children not being gay or queer, and all just because they know that I have expectations. I was like, we need more queer babies in this world. But yeah, that's kind of a terrible binary to enforce in its own way. But I am attempting to be comic here. Yeah, but that's a note that I had too, because you were talking, Robin, about 40 odd years of fighting this fight, and I was thinking one of the interesting also for me as a bisexual has been over the years examining my own fluidity in a way that I wonder if people who identify as strictly straight or as strictly gay get in a way the luxury of doing. I feel like because I've always been bi, pan, queer, however you want to put it, it means that I can roll through phases of being like, oh, I really find hypermasculinity super attractive right now. And then I'll be like, oh, no, I am really into super butch dykes right now. And because I'm already bi, I'm like, oh yeah, isn't it interesting how my hormones go and how how fluid my sexual attraction is. And I feel like I have always been a little bit more open to that and to just letting myself do that in a way that I wonder if people who don't identify as bisexual or pansexual get to have that kind of fun. I mean, it's really fun to just be open to possibilities and not feel like I have to fit into a space, even though it does mean it's sort of a constant verbal defining and re-explaining to people I meet.
It's interesting that you're talking about fluidity, because I see fluidity as something actually apart from bisexuality. My bisexuality, I think there are some people who experience their sexuality as very fluid, like the way you're describing it, that, at different points in your life, you've had different types of attraction. And I know that's something that I've heard many people describe. My bisexuality, interestingly, is pretty precise in that I'm attracted to androgyny.
Oh, interesting.
I'm attracted to the kind of people who you can't at first glance necessarily even tell their gender, to guys who are very swishy and femmy, to women who are like soft butch. And that's been pretty consistent. The thing that makes me bisexual is that the actual gender of the person could be of any gender, but I am attracted to that gender expression of androgyny. Like, I love that. That's my thing.
Well, yeah, Aisla actually mentioned that because she kind of in passing, joking, mentioned she has a type or whatever. But I think there's something to that. You might be attracted to certain traits that exist regardless of gender, and I think there's something very valid to that. In the argument for what bisexuality as an identity actually means, that it may not, and this is why I actually like the definition of pansexual, right? Because you're taking the gender a little bit out of it with that terminology, and now you can talk more about, I like these sorts of traits in people.
Yeah. When it's interesting because, I didn't know I was bi, and I won't go into a lot of it, but at one point someone asked me, I was with a man, and we were talking about LGBT issues, and they said, being gay isn't a choice. And I was like, well, no, I think it might be. And she's like, well, do you feel like you chose to be straight? And I'm like, oh, absolutely. and well, because at the time I didn't understand I was bi. And so I just thought that's what everybody went through, that like you're attracted to everybody, men and women, and then you choose because that's what you're supposed to do. And I'll just never forget the woman, the way she looked at me, and like, I'm like, oh, she just did not want to disrupt my world at that point. And then later on, when I realized that, allowed myself to notice that I was attracted to women, I was like, oh, I didn't choose. I denied that, but I thought that's what they were taught. I just thought that's what everybody did. Like you're attracted to men and women and different people, not everybody, but like the gender doesn't really make a difference, and you just don't date the people you're not supposed to, because that's how it is. And I'm like, oh, it's a denial thing. It's not a choice, right? But because I didn't know about myself, I didn't understand that wasn't what they were talking about.
Yeah, because that's something that actually gets put out a lot by folks. I like the way you just described that, because oftentimes by folks, people say, I think one of the reasons that some lesbian and gay people find bisexuality threatening is because they think it conjures up the idea of choice. But, my experience is that I did not choose to be bisexual. I discovered that I was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Man, if I had a choice, I would choose to be a lesbian. Like, if I really did have a choice, like, I just, like, mentally, I just prefer women for a relationship. But, like, the rest of me is like, we're not on board with this. You're attracted to this whole other range of things. And I'm like, God darn it. Like, shoot. Yeah, I guess it would never occur to me to accuse somebody who identifies as gay as having made a choice. And so I just assumed that I am tendered the same level of respect and choice. Like, just happens to be that I didn't make one. Like, it just, I'm just wired. I always figured I'm wired this way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe I was born this way.
So, and back to that point, we've kind of touched on a couple of ways in which interacting with the community. So, when you do interact with the community, do you feel any kind of pressure to appear a certain way? I've gathered that all three of you have been very active in the actual, LGBT community in the past. How, maybe some more stories of how that's gone and how you've managed to pull that off.
Well, I am super femmy. You can look up many, many pictures of me on the internet if you want. And I like makeup and I like dresses. I like vintage a lot. So, and I dress kind of like a 1950s librarian most of the time.
Let me also just mention that Gail is wearing lipstick for this audio interview.
Yeah, I can't not. I am addicted to red lipstick. And so one of the things that I've learned in tying with that is that, like, it's just a constant act of coming out. Like, I know anyone who meets me without a partner at all of any kind is always going to assume I am straight. And that has in part to do with how femmy I am. And, this is part of this discussion, I suppose. And so I have just accepted, and, I've turned into fine with it, and I've turned it into a game with myself. When is somebody going to ask in this conversation, or when is it going to come up, or whatever? Like, in a queer space, what are you doing in this queer space? Red lipstick wearing white girl. And in a straight space, this sort of auto assumption that that's where I am. It's a constant act of coming out. And I feel like, other members of the queer community also have that. When you are in, say, a workspace by yourself without a partner, there's often like sort of constant coming out or choosing to come out or deciding whether you should or not, and those sorts of things. But that's one of the things that I found very, very frustrating maybe a decade ago. And these days I'm just like, oh, are we at that point in the conversation again? All right, I will casually mention, my ex-girlfriend, or something, just to like make it clear that's part of my identity.
I have the unique experience of being a professional bisexual, so I think it actually takes a lot of weight off me. And I think it's a relief because, being a public figure at this point, I often don't have to come out. And honestly, that's a relief because I think it's hard to come out. It's hard to come out all the time. It's stressful. Every time I've ever had to come out, I go through all these internal conversations of, what am I going to say? How am I going to say it? I should say something. What should I say? How can I say it? When can I bring it up? Is this a good moment? No, that's not a good moment. Is this a good moment? No, that's not a good moment. And just even like, how do you bring it up comfortably and casually in the conversation? Because even if you talked about your ex-girlfriend, someone might hear, oh, well, you used to be a lesbian, now you've gone straight, right? So the question, it's hard to bring it up in casual conversation. Speaking of bisexuality, which we weren't.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's true.
It's really awkward. It can be really awkward, and then kind of holding your breath and waiting to see how the person's going to respond. Are they going to smile? Are they going to scowl? Are they going to look like you just vomited in their lap? Like what's going to happen? Are they going to say something stupid?
Yeah.
That's. I think that honestly, since I've become a professional bisexual, which is one of my titles I've given to myself, it's been a relief because most people who encounter me now already know that information. I don't have to come out to them, and thank goodness.
Yeah. I pulled an old report from the Human Rights Commission of San Francisco on bisexuality. It was really well done, and one of the things that it talked about in that is that we as bisexual people, we often deal with that sort of isolation, right? Like finding our people. It's something that you mentioned on the panel, Gail, when I was listening to you at the con, in that, trying to find your people. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, I kind of reread through it before the show, is they were saying that whereas like lesbians will experience mental distress related to their orientation when they move into an urban area, it will decrease. Bisexual women, their mental distress will increase in an urban area. And one of the theories is that it's because there's often a more active LGBTQ community, and because of the ways in which bisexuality is misunderstood and not necessarily accepted in that community, it can increase that feeling of distress when the small minority community that you think is where you belong does things to tell you don't belong. And some of the statistics on it, and I don't want to get too negative, but they're kind of upsetting that like bisexual women are twice as likely to live in poverty as lesbians, whereas and lesbians are more likely to live in poverty than straight people, so like there's a lot of stuff from that position. And I think some of it is this situation that, where there's that feeling of, do I come out? How do I come out? Is it too awkward? And the question of like, I know I'll also often go to, if I don't come out, am I hiding? I'm just tired today. Like, I don't want to have a conversation. Does that mean I'm lying to someone, or can I just not have? Can I just not have the conversation, or am I letting someone down?
Am I letting someone down by passing? That is something I think about a lot, and it is a kind of constantly like beat myself up about it sort of thing. And it was one of the things that drove me as a minor public figure, I suppose, later on in my life. Like, I was really so I'm 10 years into my career now, and for the first 5 years of my career, I was really cagey about anything to do with my identity. And part of that was like in an effort to protect my partners, in the effort to protect my family. Like, they didn't sign up for minor celebritydom with me. That was a choice that I made by becoming an author. And so I just did it out of protection for them, but also because like I kind of liked the air of mystery. Like, I will just let everybody keep guessing. Like, go for it, just guess away. Look at me, woman of mystery. But eventually I was like, all right, it's exhausting to constantly come out all the time in just day-to-day interactions. Publicly, I'm going to be open about this. And part of that was like, there aren't a lot of like public-facing voices of bi or pan advocacy who are just there openly as that, without being, like professional bisexual advocates or what have you. Like, I was like, okay, what I am is an author. That's what I do. That's how I make my living. That's my whole livelihood. Happen to be bisexual as well. Great. Okay. Let's just get this out there in the world. And then, if you are questioning or if you want someone to talk to, then sure, I will be your like bisexual auntie. And that was part of my choice was like, look, I'm just going to have it out in the universe now, and maybe it will help people because it's added one more example into the zeitgeist.
It really is important. I'll say that there's a big difference between passing and being passed over. Because I see passing as an active concealment, and being passed over is just simply, I mean, straight people don't have to run around saying they're straight, and lesbians who are partnered don't have to run around, asserting their identity over and over. Lauren Beach, who's one of the most brilliant bisexual advocates out there, she's a researcher, talks about passing privilege and passing oppression.
Interesting.
And I believe that the being passed over is a two-edged sword. It has the advantage that perhaps you don't get harassed in the street in the same way that you would if you were visibly queer. But it has the disadvantage in that you constantly get misread. You constantly have to come out over and over and over in order to be seen. It's a burden. That is a burden, and it is exhausting, and it is stressful. And the data, this is actually, now we're in my field of work, a lot of programs about the experience that bisexual people have. And what you were talking about, Acelia, is like, it's called minority stress, is the stress of holding a stigmatized identity. And that when people are under stress, they engage in coping behaviors like cigarette smoking, like alcohol consumption, like drug use, like suicidality, like self-harm, and all kinds of other things like that. And the data, you can actually see who's experiencing a lot of stress by the data, by what the data shows. And, what you said about, you were talking about, which aspect did you just talk about a moment ago?
The economic aspect.
You were talking about the economic aspect, but it plays out in depression, it plays out in suicidality, it plays out in intimate partner violence, it plays out in all kinds of different ways that bisexual people actually have very, very high rates of these things. And it's not because there's something wrong with our identity; it's because we're under a tremendous amount of stress in this culture. And I think part of it is what both of you have talked about, the idea of the stress of being invisible, the stress of having to come out constantly, the stress of coming out in 2010 18, and then in 2019, someone says, I know you said you were bisexual last year. Are you still bisexual? You know, that constantly having to reassert your identity. Or I know you said you were bisexual last year, but now you have a partner. Does that mean that you're straight now? Does that mean that you're gay now? That constantly having to defend yourself and assert yourself and affirm yourself. And it's a lot of work.
Yeah. Is it all right if I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay. Gail, one of the things that you said at the beginning, and I know more about it because I attended your panel, was that you write about found families and happy endings. And I'd love for you to share a little bit more about that, because I feel like that is also a really important and powerful thing that is happening. I know so many people find hope in literature, and because you're so intentional about it, I really appreciate you sharing a little bit about that.
Sure. So I feel like there is a bit of a renaissance right now going on, particularly in genre fiction. And by genre fiction, I mean science fiction and fantasy and romance in particular, although horror and, adventure and crime and mystery and stuff are also part of this. But in those three, there's definitely a renaissance partly brought about by the indie book movement in queer writing and writers and main characters and characterization. And it's fantastic. I mean, the romance community in particular, there's like a huge amount of gay romance and lesbian romance. And partly that's because there's always been a want for it and a need for it. But big publishers didn't recognize it, and or the audience wasn't big enough if you're getting into very obscure niches in romance and tropes in romance, for example. But a lot of that writing and a lot of the queer writing that gets the most attention, particularly from the literary community now, is advocacy or is anger-driven or is fight-driven. And that is admirable, and some of these authors are just freaking brilliant. But it is dealing with a lot of the things that Robin is talking about, and dealing with it in a narrative, like, important fashion that should be dealt with and should be out in the world and should be there for people to read. But I personally, because of the struggle of being queer in this world, really don't want to read about that struggle that much anymore in my old age. And sort of one of the things I came around to was, what I want to read about is the people I know and the people I love, or versions of them, finding family and happy ever afters. And I decided for me personally that it was just really important to just like push that out into the world and be like, I'm not the kind of person who's going to go march. I'm sorry to say, I was dragged to way too many when I was a kid. And I'm not the kind of person who, like Robin, feels like I can turn my whole life into advocacy. But what I can do is take what I do have in my wheelhouse and in my back pocket, which is a certain amount of skill to write charming, whimsical, friendly, funny, romantic books, and give that to all of, my queer community. And so that's what I did. And it just, for me, like, I'm not saying this is like a profoundly noble end or whatever. I'm just saying that there is a certain amount of good to be had in putting narratives out into the world that are positive for us to read.
Well, we need them. We need them.
We really do need them.
We do.
And so that was my sort of banner to pick up and just be like, okay. And that's what I read. And that's what I'm constantly talking about when I'm like promoting other people's work on the internet, and when I'm like, I have a read-along group that I do, and I'm just constantly reading, particularly romances in queer spaces, and just being like, look, here's an awesome one. And I go for like disability and own voices and like any range that I can get a hold of. Like if isn't an awesome, like beautifully built fantasy world with a fantastic queer romance in it, I am like, I will cry this book from the rooftops. Because it just makes me feel so good to read them. It makes me feel so good to write them, and it makes me feel so good to put them out there. So there's my little soapbox.
Well, thank you for doing that. Positive stories can be healing, and I do think we need more stories, and we need the hard ones, but we also need the positive ones. And I think I agree with you. I think that can be a wonderful thing to
I hope. I mean, like
when you're not feeling so great, it can really make you feel better.
To pick it up, yeah. I mean, the favorite things that have ever happened to me is people coming up from the queer community, which I consider my community, and saying, look, I read You know, I have a gender bending sort of femme butch character. And I've had multiple kids, and she appears as a child in my young adult book. And I have multiple kids who are like, my mother passed me these books because I wrote both adult and young adult. And so when my adult readers found my young adult books, they picked them up and gave them to their kids. And their kids was like, and in that book is queer rap. And the kid was like, oh, I felt okay coming out to my mom because she had passed me your books. And so I knew that, you know, we'd never had a conversation about this, but I knew that it would be okay. And I'm like, oh my God, that makes me feel so good. Because that's where fiction has its power, is in like the ability to give us like the myths that we didn't have growing up, or, you know, or in the zeitgeist, in the wider world that we aren't taught in school or anything. So
we need someone sometimes to imagine it for us, especially when we're low. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, it is my profound privilege, quite frankly. I feel really, really lucky.
It's your superpower, I guess.
That and kind of arbitrarily turning off street lamps. I don't know if anybody else gets this, but I will walk under a street lamp and it will just turn off. That's my yeah. I can't control it, but there it is.
Well, so I have one final question, and I think there's a lot of things that people could glean from the various experiences you've talked about, but I feel like something that might end this well for somebody who's listening and identifies as bisexual or whatever is just maybe some general advice. You know, if you had a quick quip to somebody figuring things out that you could share.
Well,
that's the hardest question.
So, this is Robin again. So I think one of the most important things is to find resources and find community. All of my work, when I'm not speaking in front of an audience, a lot of my work is about trying to create those resources. So I've edited 2 anthologies. One of them is called Getting By. Get it?
Love it.
Getting By, Voices of Bisexuals Around the World. It's a 42-country anthology, and it's a wonderful little grassroots project. And another book that I co-edited was called Recognize the Voices of Bisexual Men. You know, I believe that bisexual men have a particular kind of erasure and oppression, and I wanted to do something about it. So I creatively partnered with a bisexual man, and we made this beautiful anthology. And I'm also the editor of Bi Woman Quarterly, which is a free it's a free publication that is available electronically and also in print. And it's available at biwomanboston.org. biwomanboston.org. Mm-hmm. And we make it free, and it's a grassroots publication. It comes out every 3 months. It has, we try to get a really wide range of voices in terms of age, racial identity, geographic location, perspective, politics, and anything else you might think of. And I love that because I think, kind of like what Gail does, I think that seeing yourself represented in print or on a screen is really, really important. I think we need more documentaries. We need more stories. We need more both fiction and nonfiction. We need to be able to see ourselves represented. And because bisexual people come in every shape, size, color, location, and every other possible identity combination, we need lots of stories. And so that's a lot of my work is about creating a lot of stories. And I guess, Gail, you write it into your fiction. You can write all these beautiful, varied characters with these different experiences. And that's what people need, because I think if we can put out a lot of different representations out there, some people will find what they're looking for. They'll see themselves reflected in something somewhere that will make them feel that it's possible for them to exist and find happiness. And I guess in terms of the advice, Eric, I would say find community. Just make sure that you are not alone. Make sure that you have people you can talk to, whether they be next to you in the room or whether they be on the internet, but find community. Community is life-saving.
Yep, I love that.
this is really hard because one of the things that I always try to do with this sort of question is imagine when I was younger and sort of coming out and trying to, like, the piece of advice that I would have wanted to give to myself. And I guess it's kind of twofold. It's both now, at least, it's both not as hard and harder than it once was. In terms of, like, there is a community, you can find it, the internet's there. I mean, so, and someone is writing the thing that you need, and someone is blogging about the thing that you don't want to read. It's just, it sometimes takes a little while to come out about it and find it and figure it out. But also, like, it isn't easy, and like sort of advocates in the gay community often say, like coming out is on your own terms, and you should do it at your own pace and in a way that keeps you safe in whatever environment you're in. And, you know, best of luck with that. But if you're super lucky, you'll find your tribe and your community, and then who you are attracted to will not matter. And wouldn't it be great if we all got to have that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll also just say, I think there's a real power in visibility. If you do come to a place in your life where you feel like you can be public and be open and be yourself, you will be a beacon to other people. I do all kinds of visibility things. I have an Etsy shop that is actually part of how we support Bi Women Quarterly. And one of the things we sell are little bisexual pride earrings. And I wear them almost every day, because one of the things that's really interesting is I have had so many random people come up to me and go, some people just say, "Oh, I like your earrings." Other people say, "I like your earrings." Say, "Yes, they're bisexual pride earrings." And they're like, "I know." And I just think there's such a power in that, because, again, it's like it makes people feel possible. It makes people feel like they're not so alone. And there are all kinds of amazing, things, little things you can do to help make the road easier for other people as well as for yourself.
Yeah. I think the advice that I would say is, especially to people who are, just discovering or just coming out, would be, don't take people's first reactions as their final landing point. Most of us had to go through some form of discovery process to understand how we are. And it can be, hard when we share and somebody reacts in a way that doesn't feel particularly good. And one of the things that I came to understand is that, what took me, several years in some ways to get to, I wanted them to get to in like 10 seconds. And it wasn't maybe fair either to them or to me or to our relationship. And so I found that if I could give people a little time to kind of adjust to that experience, the conversation ended up being, much more connective. And a lot of people that I thought I lost, I actually was able to connect to and have some closeness with again. And so I feel like, not to say that it's okay for people to treat you badly or accept that, and to just also realize that, that process might take them a little time too, and that's okay. They can have that. They don't necessarily have to do it with you. There's other resources they can find. But
you read this book, yes.
Yeah, but you read this book. But that's probably the advice that I would give. And can we ask Gail to share what she's up to before we close? Or
yeah, absolutely. And so, and just for our listeners and for your benefits, we're going to have links for everything that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. So, and we'll have those in our show notes. So yeah. We'll definitely point people. But yeah.
And if there's anything else you wanted to share, Robin, I know you touched on some of the work you're doing, but I just wanted to make sure you both had a chance to share anything about stuff that you've got going on. Or
absolutely.
So sure. Once again, my name is Gail Carriger. That's the Gail spelling, and Carriger, Carriger. And I'm pretty good on my SEO. So whatever platform you want to find me on, you can Google my name and then that platform, or you can just go to my website. There's a calling card feature on my website, so you can drop me a line if you'd like to. And I'm pretty accessible. I'm always open to a chat. All of my books have queer characters. I have specifically some books that have main queer characters, and it's pretty obvious if you read the blurbs which ones those are. My most recent one that might be most interesting to people is a book called The Fifth Gender, which is a cozy mystery science fiction romance between a purple alien with tentacle hair that comes from a race with 5 different genders and his human detective crush. It kind of, I guess, loosely might be gay romance, but 5 genders, so not quite. So yeah, but it's really, it is fun, it is loving, it is sweet, and it has a very happy ending. But it is also kind of my exploration of the association of physical appearance and gender identity and what that means and how we as a society can have a conversation about binary and the negative impact of those sorts of innate initial assumptions. So, but it's also fun and cute and silly. So hopefully I am having this conversation in a very gentle way. So yeah, Gail Carriger. And that book is The Fifth Gender.
Okay, thanks.
So, okay, I'll do mine. I'm Robin Oakes. And by the way, that's spelled R-O-B-Y-N. And then Oakes is O-C-H-S. Without that assistance, nobody will ever spell it correctly. So I guess the things that I'm working on right now are, besides the books I've already produced, our By Women Quarterly is an ongoing project. And again, it's one of my prides and joys because it highlights so many amazing people's voices. I also am on social media. I am on Twitter as Robin Oakes. I am on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I am on all the social medias. And my website is, you'll never guess, robinoakes.com.
Nice.
I'm sneaky. And yeah, so I can be found in a lot of places. And I've published a lot of my articles, my chapters that I've published in various books and publications are available for free on my website. I have a section of that because I believe that the things that I have to say are really important and life-saving, and I just want to make sure that they're accessible to as many people as possible. So if you did go to my website, you could find some interesting articles to read, including one that circles back to where we began the conversation, one that I have a couple of articles specifically about biphobia.
Nice. Well, and if anybody is listening from Alaska or Mississippi, let's help Robin finish out the country.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, because I can't retire until I get to all 50.
Oh, there you go.
There you go. Well, I wanted to say thank you for everyone being here. Fantastic. And with that, I think we're going to wrap the show. So let me say thanks for listening. You can join our mailing list at bit.ly/bicure, B-I-C-U-R, and get episodes and blogs conveniently mailed directly to you. Learn more about us at bicurian.com/podcast.
If you like what we are doing, please rate us on your listening platform of choice.
Thank you.